The people's flag is deepest red, it's shrouded off the martyred day. And ere the limbs grew stiff and cold, their heart's blood died in every fold. Then raised the scarlet standard high, beneath its folds we'll live and die. Though cowards flinch and traitors sneer, we'll keep the red flag flying here.
Welcome to MR Conversations in honor of Helena Sheehan's second volume of her autobiography, Until We Fall. The subtitle is Long Distance Life on the Left, and that's essentially what we're going to be talking about today. The central storyline of Sheehan's book is her political activism as waves of history swept through the left and challenged it in ever more formidable ways, bringing some victories, but also, yes, many defeats.
We discuss the past from where we are now. And, those of us that have been as intensely engaged on the left as all of us here have, it's been a very rocky road. I think we have to fight for every bit of space that we can get. And even if we're on the margins, I say the margins aren't nowhere.
Well, speaking for me as a member but not a responsible person in the Democratic Socialists of America, it feels to me as though the movement for socialism has never been stronger in my lifetime, and probably never stronger even in my parents' lifetime and in their part of the struggle in the Communist Party. And so I'm feeling thrilled. In the advance of going of the election this past Tuesday, I was ringing doorbells for a socialist candidate for the New York City Council who was running for re-election and who had been targeted by the ultra-right for her support for a ceasefire in Palestine and Israel. And it was just thrilling how well received we all were. And of course, she won the election with great success. So I'm really very optimistic about where we're going in spite of all the confusion, in spite of all the divisions we have, and they are significant. I think things are just great. I'm a cockeyed optimist. There was, like a week and a half ago, a more or less flash mob of thousands of people in Grand Central Station, organized by Jewish Voice for Peace. Just astonishing to see this outpouring of people, and was done only with, at the last minute, at 2 minutes of 6, everyone knew where to show up. And that couldn't have been done without the flexibility and the interaction of social media. It's just been a lovely thing to watch and participate in. One of the things that I most admire about the young people I see today is their ability to connect through social media, to connect through the internet, to coordinate and consult with each other in ways that were never before possible, and which result in a much more, what should I say, horizontal structure, where the kind of top-down leadership that I experienced in the New Left, and that was nominally not there but was hidden away someplace, the kind of top-down structure that was involved in the communist movements cannot exist.
How are you feeling at this moment, Kate? And then we'll move to Helena.
I'm feeling as if I must be living on a different planet to Daniel, to be honest. I mean, okay, so I live in London. We've had the most incredible pro-Palestinian demonstrations. It's an absolutely extraordinary outpouring. But of course, that is against the backdrop of having a far-right government, disastrous developments in Britain over the last decade or more. We've had Brexit, which has been pretty much a disaster for everybody here in Britain. We've had 13 or so years of Tory rule. We've had prime ministers that have completely trashed our economy, wiping tens of thousands of ordinary people's pension pots and goodness knows what. We've had COVID, where millions of people have died. You know, we've got massive cost of living crisis. We've got a crumbling NHS, deteriorating infrastructure, people living in poverty, going to food banks. You know, this is a terrible place that we're in. And we had, as Helena mentioned in her book, we had briefly the kind of hope around Corbyn taking the Labour Party to the left. That's finished. So it's possible now to have a hopeful moment. It's possible now that the massive upsurge around Gaza, both in Britain and everywhere else pretty much, that will enable a change on the left, which desperately needs to change itself and make itself capable of working in unity and actually doing something for ordinary people rather than kind of posturing. That would be a great thing. But how terrible that the people of Gaza having to go through this terrible experience, you know, to shake people out of their inertia and their self-centered complacency about being a big fish in a small pool or whatever it is that holds the left back. So one great thing, of course, is that last week they tried to ban, the Home Secretary wanted to ban our demonstration. That didn't happen. She is now being sacked today. So, and that's because she tried to whip up the far right against the demonstration by calling it a hate march. And she took on the police and said that the police, you know, favoritized the left, you know, which is obviously complete nonsense. So she went a step too far with her far right ideological stuff. And, you know, the ruling class and the establishment have turned against her and she's out, you know, so maybe there will be opportunities, but I hope the left will overcome some of its previous poor record, you know, on unity and taking things forward in the interests of everybody. So let's do what we can to free Palestine and do what we can to unite the left.
Even just in those few minutes, so many of the problems that we face have been articulated so clearly. I'm very glad to hear Daniel so optimistic, and I think one of the reasons why he is that he's found something that feels like an appropriate vehicle for his activity in DSA. Kate is facing the situation in London where, you know, the whole Labour Party, particularly the Labour left, is falling apart. Kate has been, she didn't mention it, but she's been trying for years to build a broad left, more left party, way more left than Labour, but still broad and inclusive, called Left Unity. And I very much admire that. And I think that Kate and others are hoping for a revival of this now because of the trajectory that the Labour Party has taken.
Yeah, for me, it's engagement with the movement, and I mean the movement widely, you know, the movement of ordinary people struggling for many different goals. You know, many people are involved with trade unions and other kinds of things. For me, it's been the peace and anti-war movement. You know, we've interfaced with the World Social Forum, which was extraordinary mobilization of people. And then just on Saturday, to return to our massive Palestine demonstration here, you know, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, overwhelmingly young people, people volunteered to steward who'd never been out on a demonstration before, you know, and whatever bits of the left, as we see it, do or don't do, there will always be that upsurge of humanity for justice, for peace, for liberation, and that's what keeps us going. And It's almost like we have to keep up and help the movement, not always have a feeling we have to lead it. You know, that's not always, you know, we can play a role in that from experience, but the people are there and the people are on the move.
I think what we have going for us is that we on the left, broadly speaking, actually understand the world better than anybody else by a considerable distance. We have an analysis of the world, not that we agree on every little thing, far from it, as we all know, but we have an analysis of the geopolitical forces that are in motion in the world that nobody else, quite honestly, has. And we have commitment to address that. What we haven't found is an appropriate vehicle for, you know, either in national or international terms, except in pockets where people like Daniel find that in the DSA, which is, you know, it's not the old-fashioned vanguard party. We've had our experiences of that. Daniel's parents were both active in the Communist Party, and both Kate and I didn't come from communist parties, but found our way to communist parties. And it's very much part of our experience on the left that shaped us. And it's very much part of the experience that I articulate here. In my previous book, Navigating the Zeitgeist, I speak about, you know, my time with the US New Left, and then in the Communist Party. Actually, I belong to two communist parties. I belong to the CPI here in Ireland in the 70s. And then in the 2000s, I belonged to the South African Communist Party during my periods in South Africa. And I still feel myself very tied to the history of the communist movement. So as this book opens, it's the period of glasnost and perestroika. And those of us, you know, who were critical communists that found we didn't have space for ourselves in communist parties anymore, were really heartened by this. We felt this was what we really believed in: socialism with a human face, socialism with economic efficiency, socialism with, you know, outstretched hands. We were so excited and hopeful about what was going on in the Soviet Union and more broadly in Eastern Europe at the time. And I deal with that very vividly in the books. I spent a lot of those years, the late 80s and the early 90s, in Eastern Europe. I was coming and going between Ireland and Eastern Europe pretty constantly. And even when I wasn't in Eastern Europe, my head was in Eastern Europe. It was, you know, one of the biggest world historically important things that's happened in my lifetime. And basically, I felt as if I saw the world turned upside down, that my chapter is titled "The World Turned Upside Down." And by this time, I'd been a Marxist for several decades, and I believed that the world was moving somehow, in however complicated a way, from capitalism to socialism. And there, before our eyes, and we couldn't deny it, we saw vast stretches of the world moving from socialism, however imperfect it was, but it still was a form of socialism, to capitalism. I believe what actually happened was global capital moving in on it, and they played on forces from within and played on every form of dissatisfaction. And there was dissatisfaction with those socialist societies. They could see that there was a higher standard of consumption elsewhere in the world. They could see that people could travel places where they couldn't travel. And so they began to articulate this and demonstrate it. And the parties themselves, particularly the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, decided, you know, to open up and let all of this out, let people speak, and they did. And the party itself lost its way, in my opinion. See, when a communist part, when any party is in power, it attracts people that are attracted to parties in power, who aren't necessarily the same kind of people who join communist parties when it means, you know, wrecking your career or going to prison, or it's like the opposite. And so a lot of those people in communist parties at the time. And so there was pressure from without, pressure from within, and it all exploded. So people, you know, broke very quickly and dramatically from a socialist way of organizing a society to a capitalist one. A lot of the people that were on the streets were only looking for a better form of socialism. Not all of them actually were looking for what they got, although some of them were looking for capitalism, because capitalism was, you know, a fairy tale. It was a higher standard of living. It was Disneyland. And they very quickly discovered that it was anything but that. And so, you know, I was coming and going to Eastern Europe and, you know, seeing people clearing the desks in their offices, moving from, you know, one part of the city to another, further and further from the centers of the city. I was seeing people, you know, showing me fields where they had grown crops for decades and, you know, wondering if they're going to be pushed off this land altogether, or were the former owners just going to come and extract rents they couldn't possibly pay. I saw people whose lives were being turned upside down. But also, when I was in Ireland and Britain, I was seeing the left affected by this in a very drastic way. I watched the Communist Party of Great Britain liquidate itself. I found the CPI extremely disoriented about it. They followed the party line, the Soviet Union, about everything until glasnost and perestroika, and felt betrayed by the party whose line they questioned no matter what. It wasn't just people having political arguments. I saw quite a few party members die at that time. And I don't think that was accidental. I think that it was a challenge to think your way through it. As I explained, my whole philosophy of history was in crisis over this. So I had to think my way through it. I got up in the morning, I could think about almost nothing else during those years because I had to figure this out. But other people, they were used to other people doing that thinking for them. And they were very disoriented, and there was a loss of meaning. And that's a lot of what happened in Eastern Europe too. A lot of people actively believed in socialism, but a lot of other people just passively believed in it. And then the ground came from under them. And even those that had more actively believed in it, a lot of them lost their belief in it. And so, you know, there was this hollowness at the core of their lives. I just saw so many consequences, not only in political and economic terms. I mean, economically, it was a more brutal form of capitalism any of us have ever experienced. It was nothing like what they were looking for, except for a small elite that managed to game the new system in a certain kind of way. And some of them were the same ones that gave the old system in a certain kind of a way. But for vast stretches, vast sections of the population, it was absolutely brutal. And so it wasn't only political and economic, and that was bad enough, but psychologically, people were so deeply, deeply disoriented. There was such a lack of meaning. Kate, how did you experience that?
Well, what a question. I mean, it was probably one of the most difficult experiences of my life, if not the most difficult, certainly politically. I'd been a member of the CPGB since 1979, 1980, around about that time. And I'd become very involved in the London district of the Communist Party. And in fact, in the last couple of years, I was elected as London District Secretary, I was pretty young, actually. So it's a big responsibility. But it was as if these kind of massive external forces, you know, of the most kind of, you know, tectonic plate type significance were just kind of bearing down on us. And we had to find a way of dealing with it, you know, actually what was going on in the world and what the reality of it was and how that related to us and what we could do. And we found ourselves in the situation where the leadership of our party basically didn't want to carry on with the party anymore. And I don't think there were many other places in Europe, certainly in Western Europe, where that was actually the case. In many countries, they either reformed and continued or found new ways of working with others and reformulated a kind of Marxist or communist party. But in Britain, no, that was it, basically dissolution. And I was one of the people who fought to maintain the Communist Party, not as it had been, because it had been flawed in many ways, but to maintain the essence of it, which was anti-imperialist, which was Marxist, which was on the side of the people, yes to being more environmentalist, and yes to actually, it wasn't bad on things like women and social movements, to kind of embrace that, but being something that embraced all of society and worked out how to take that forward, in a kind of Marxist way. The difficulty was finding a way to continue with the politics that we had without that formal structure anymore. And so we went into a kind of bit of a mini wilderness of different organizations trying to work together and so on. But I mean, as you will know, because we've talked about it many times, finding ways of identifying what are the key issues that you have to have unity on, and that is the basis for working together, not what you thought about something that happened in the 1930s at some point, but we are anti-capitalist, we are for the people, how are we going to organize together? Those of us who don't trash the Russian revolutionary experience, we recognize the great things about that and its kind of massive liberatory impact globally. How do we take that forward and not rush, as many people did, unfortunately, many on the left rushed to trash that and consign it to the dustbin of history and embrace the so-called new reality.
I come to this with a very different perspective from Helena and Kate, because I was never attracted to the communist movements the way they were, and had very deep reservations about the conditions in Eastern Europe, both from my personal acquaintance with how people were living there and from my sense of the politics overall, other than the fabulous, wonderful work of the South African Communist Party in resisting apartheid. Very difficult to understand how the international communist movement, as it existed in Eastern Europe, contributed a whole lot to what was going on. They were a main impediment, in my opinion, to trying to talk about anti-capitalist positions, because whenever you would say that, you would say, well, how about what it's like in the Soviet Union? What is life like in Czechoslovakia after the Prague Spring? How many people were working for the Stasi in Eastern Europe? The model of socialism that was created a vast impediment to us who were socialists. So it was not in my opinion, a great thing. And to me, the one of the greater mysteries was why people say, imagine the time of the Slansky trials in Eastern Europe, people who had been fighting against fascism in Spain from international brigades returned to Germany, to Czechoslovakia, gosh, all over Eastern Europe. And a very weird event occurred, which may have been motivated by anti-Semitism. A bunch of people who had taken leading roles in the communist governments post-war. And they were, arrested. They were tried in kangaroo courts. They were tortured. The rationale behind this happening has never been satisfactorily explained to anybody. Why did not the communist parties of Eastern Europe say, excuse me, to the Soviet Union when they demanded the execution and the imprisonment of the Slansky defendants, of the so-called Spaniards? Those are I asked that question of my parents because they knew the Spaniards. They knew Slansky, they knew Arthur London, they knew Rudy Feisterman, people who were all put in terrible jeopardy because they were Jews and veterans of the Spanish Civil War. But they were all arrested, put in jail, some of them killed, and it was a remarkable disgrace. And so I'm not quite sure what to make of the enthusiasm that people felt for the communist parties. I mean, and certainly worse when we found that the policies of the Soviet Union in areas where Russians were not an ethnic majority were to import Russians and put them in positions of leadership throughout the Soviet socialist republics. What should I say? Led me to think that the solutions that the Soviet Communist Party found, Russification, that is, were just a terrible idea. Was not a solution at all. Was a solution which meant everybody had to be subject to the Russians. So, you know, I did not see the collapse of the Soviet Union as a collapse of socialism, and still I'm puzzled by it.
I want to respond to Daniel there. I mean, terrible things happened, and I'm not going to factually argue about any of those things because, he's not factually wrong about any of them. Really terrible things happened. The Slansky trials, the crushing of the Prague Spring, the Cultural Revolution in China. I mean, things that we really have to come to terms with and take very seriously. I mean, lives were crushed. But on the other hand, the expropriators were expropriated. Millions of people rose up from, darkness, illiteracy, poverty, to a relatively high standard of living, and standard of relative decency in their everyday lives. And also, these countries were an example to the rest of the world that something other than capitalism, however imperfect, screamingly, tragically imperfect, but something other was possible, that then something you could work with to make something better. And I still think this story is important, which is why I'm still writing about it and talking about it. I think with everything, I don't think there's anything terrible that anybody can tell me about these countries at this stage. Maybe some detail somewhere, but overall, I know it. But I still think with all that, there is more to defend than to denounce in big world historical terms. And as well as the very real things that Daniel points out, these countries were subjected to massive, massive slander, as China is being subjected to massive slander and hostility now. And I still think those of us who live under capitalism have to defend not only the possibility of socialism, but the partial achievement of it, from which we have to learn and build. So that was a lot of my motivation in writing my way through all of this.
One of the things I always used to discuss with my students is that communism, as state socialism, was a very successful development model, economic development model for countries coming out of the kind of imperialist colonialist experience, and hence, because it offered a way of getting there politically, but also an economic way of then developing the society and the forces of production and all that kind of stuff. So small wonder that, massively, and also national liberation, as well. So small wonder that places like Vietnam and many other former colonies chose to adopt that form of organization, political and economic organization. So I think those are very, very positive things. She talked about the need for a counter narrative of the socialist years. And I very, very strongly agree with that, you know, so, you know, enough of people just rubbishing it and all that. You know, there are very positive things to build on and learn from.
There was this sense that, yay, the West has won, socialism is over, capitalism is triumphant, and not only capitalism, but USA. And we all know about the Fukuyama articles. Actually, the Fukuyama article, which then was a book, is actually a very serious work in philosophy of history. But it got constantly quoted, you know, everywhere in the mass media. And it was all, you know, the end of history. It's all capitalism has won. There are no other big battles. They're just tiny little, you know, adjustments to capitalism to make it work ever better. So at this period, my second chapter is called The New World Order, like what came after all of this, you know, this great victory of capitalism, and what kind of world were we living in those years, say in the 1990s. But at one point, the whole decade had gone by and I hadn't set foot in the country. I mean, naturally, we never escape it. It's on our news every night in Hollywood movies, and you know, you're never away from it, no matter where you are. But I came back to the US in 1991 after being away. And with all this rhetoric, the West has won and this society is so triumphant. And I wrote an article about it at the time called America's Symptoms of Decline. It didn't feel like a society that had won. It felt like a society that again had this hollowness at the core of it, where there was no real belief. There was no real meaning. There was a sense that it was all falling apart. And I was wondering, you know, as you read those pages, did that, because I mean, obviously you were living there this whole time that I was gone. And so I was seeing it in particularly sharp relief, but you were living there all this time. And I was wondering how my account of it struck you.
It was a very difficult time. The left was very divided. The struggle for socialism was felt as though socialism was no longer on any agenda whatsoever. I was just thinking about this in regard to the very beginning of the Clinton administration in 1993 and thereabouts, when there was, it felt, suddenly a huge opening to what was left of the left. There was an invitation for some kind of national health system. I was part of the American Public Health Association movement to try to negotiate with the White House for national health insurance. It felt like we were right on the edge of a very big set of changes without having big popular support. There was no massive outpouring, but there was suddenly a vast opportunity there, it felt like. And part of that was that we didn't have, those of us who were doing this, didn't have a mass line. We were not sitting there ringing the doorbell asking people to struggle against the health insurance system. We would instead we were negotiating with the White House. We were honored to be negotiating with the White House because we felt like we didn't have any support below us. There was no mass group below us. So yes, on the left at least, I think we were in terrible trouble in the 90s. And people were very unfocused. For me, the very big change began with Occupy. We began to see a sea change in the thought of young people in the time. And I was too impatient with that young man that died way too young, David Graeber, who we should have been much more engaged with, it seems to me. I don't know if you guys felt as though you were engaged with David when he was in the UK, but certainly I felt as though he was too loose a thinker. I would not have believed before I read it that debt. I think it's worth looking at because it is loose. It isn't as systematic as I would like, but it is so brilliant that it brings people in a way that to me is inspiring.
I appreciated on page 305, you talked about the question of multi-generational movements, and you said that during Occupy, you noticed that your New Left contemporaries were writing about this movement as them, analyzing what they were doing. And so I want to extend, as somebody who was involved in Occupy Wall Street very, very deeply in New York City, my appreciation to you all as people who didn't do that and who continue to be engaged, and throughout that process during Occupy Wall Street also continued to be engaged.
What we're lacking, what at least I feel we're lacking here in Brooklyn, is that we have not put together a comprehensive worldview. The worldview that my parents had, the worldview that I thought we were trying to articulate in the early SDS, but those seem to have sort of slipped away from us. But I do think that those of us trying to think about how to articulate an integrated worldview have an enormous task of both listening to the young people and trying to be in dialogue with them. It's a very difficult task.
Yeah, I was very involved in the Occupy movement here in Dublin, as I've described in some detail in the book, and
Yes.
there were many points of view articulated. But the globally, the Occupy movement showed some massive alienation all over the world. The statistics for where the Occupy movement was at its peak, it was everywhere. Um, and it showed the massive alienation from the global system. And I was there, you know, nearly every day. And I organized a thing called Occupy University, which, you know, it was just, they were just circles of people, some days small, some days massive, right on the streets, right in at the center of Dublin. And that was the objective of doing that, is to try to, you know, get this disaffection and these details gathered up into some kind of systemic analysis. There's a particularly interest in what way did the whole global financial system work, how the system really worked, as opposed to what way they were always told that it worked. And you know, we need, you know, opportunities like that, you know, where people were so open and receptive and also so bleak about their own prospects. It's changed a bit since then. At the time, a lot of the young people that came to the Occupy movement in Ireland were very anxious about their prospects for employment. Now that has changed utterly, utterly. We've gone from a society that had high unemployment for most of the life of the state to a society where we have what they refer to is not it's not statistically full employment, but is virtually full employment. And we have massive labor shortages at every level, you know, from people to clean the lavatories to people, you know, being, you know, hospital surgeons. At every level in our economy, we have massive labor shortages, but at the same time, we have a massive accommodation crisis. Not only, you know, for houses, you know, to buy, but to rent. Rents are astronomical. House prices are astronomical. So, you know, to get people to fill all these vacancies that we have in our employment market, we have to recruit people from abroad, but there's nowhere to accommodate them. So it's kind of reversed from the way it was even at that time during the Occupy movement. But the common thing is that there, you know, is another generation of young people with massive anxiety about how to build their future. They do feel they can get jobs now, but can they afford to live? Can they get those jobs and afford to live here, or where will they live? And as a society, we're faced with that now. But there's just massive anxiety about the practicalities of life, and then the current cost of living crisis, and just the general instability in the world, and you know, and all this cultural intellectual fragmentation. And although at the same time, there's some kind of prosperity that the society never knew before, but, you know, very unequally distributed. And But it isn't just the, the economic distribution. It's all this, the psychology that goes with anxiety about finding your way in all of that. So, Kate, I wanted to ask you about your reaction to how universities have changed over these decades. And in my previous book, I tried to describe university life in the 1960s and this whole agenda we had for history from below and reshaping academe. Radical philosophy, radical science, gender studies, and ethnicity studies, race studies, all of this. And the agenda has drastically changed, but I think a lot of us that are still around in the universities were shaped by that agenda that we brought to bear in the 1960s. The whole agenda of the universities has been reshaped more and more totally by the market. And so I particularly want to ask you, Kate, how did that strike you? Because you also were a full-time academic until you decided to become full-time general secretary of the CND. Isn't that right?
That's
how did you see that trajectory?
Well, interesting. And this was when I was reading it, I thought, there are so many points at which there's a kind of strong interface between what you were doing and what I was doing. And of course, the communist movement was one, but the academic life was the other. And I got my first full-time university teaching post in the early 1990s, and I carried on through until 2010, when, as you say, I migrated to CND full-time, so to speak. I had a pretty good experience, to be honest, of university life. I worked at London South Bank University, which was formerly a polytechnic, and I joined at the time when it was making the transitions from polytechnic to university, which was also a time of massive expansion of university numbers, really opening up, no longer elitist, incredible diversity, largely working class people from local communities, really open to ideas and discussing stuff. So it was incredible. And in my faculty, the dean was very committed to the staff, the kind of makeup of the staff also looking like what our society is like. So the student body looked like the society locally, and so did the staff. And so it was a real kind of great experience and a real privilege to work in that environment. And as I started from around about early 2000s, I became CND chair in 2002, which is a lay position. So I was still working at the university. And the then vice chancellor and the staff were very supportive, and thought it was a great thing, that there was this kind of link between the kind of the peace movement and the university. And I taught courses about, peace and war and those kinds of things. So it was a great kind of synergistic thing. But then after a while, I couldn't put an exact date on it, the culture began to change, not within our faculty, but coming from the top, which was no doubt driven by wider national forces, became, as you say so clearly in the book, about marketization of education and commercialization of education, and not only in terms of how many students can you get in to help pay for the courses and all that. That was one element, of course, because we weren't rich institutions, but then also about how you run things and, management speak and the way in which things are talked about and the way in which staff and their time become commodified. And, senior management would try and get us to do kind of some sort of management training thing, and we eventually did a couple of things, and we found them so banal and useless and talking to us as if we were children and had no knowledge of anything in the world. We got together and refused to do it, which was good. Collective power, but trying to impose things upon us that were completely inappropriate for an academic setting and a kind of teaching and learning setting. So that's how it was. Sometimes now I miss the students. Sometimes they come up to me on demonstrations and we have a talk about it all. But I don't miss the way the university had gone.
You said on page 94, you found yourself instructing students on the irrelevance of canonical texts they hadn't even read. If you could talk about that for a minute, that would be really interesting. And then also, sometimes I get a little concerned with people saying nowadays, don't read Deleuze, don't read Negri, et cetera, et cetera. So you had this new fragmentation of knowledge where there's no common reference point. Nobody's read the same books. Nobody's seen the same movies, whereas previously everybody was kind of able to refer back to common texts that everyone was reading, maybe even at the same time.
Yeah, I think that, those of us that are old, and I don't resist the word, because it's a fact of life, I'm 79, which is actually my 80th year of life, and you feel you're in the end game. I articulate this in the book too, like time is running out. So I feel, even more pressed to do what I can do. Actually, I'm quite healthy and I still have a lot of go in me, but I don't have all the time in the world. So how am I going to do it? And I feel so passionately about having an analysis that other people don't have. I don't mean me personally, but Marxism really needs to be brought to bear on this world. It has everything to offer, because it incites both clarity and commitment, which are what the world needs and what we have to bring to it. And so, it's a lot of my motivation in writing this book is to to tell my story about that, about how I see it, and raise questions about what next. I mean, especially people like Daniel and I think of a similar age and place, grew up where there was this. Well, of course, Daniel grew up in a family that was different from it. I never knew people like Daniel and his family, but in the America I grew up in the 1950s, it was a society that really believed in itself, and I was Catholic, and Catholicism was a very coherent, comprehensive worldview. And it felt like the society was really stable and sure of itself. And then in the 60s, for a lot of us, all of that fell apart. But for people like me, and there were many people like me who came to the left, what we did was we lost a worldview, but we reconstructed another worldview. I could never live with anything that was less coherent and comprehensive than Catholicism. And it took me a decade, but I became a Marxist after that. But I found that the generations I was teaching in university had never experienced that sense of a clear, coherent, comprehensive worldview. They never experienced that sense of stability in a society that had basic values that more or less everybody believed in. Of course, in America, the 1950s, there were these communists that were evil somehow, but they weren't really American, as the rest of us were taught to think about them. So the generations I was facing in universities, not only universities, but in the wider culture, had never had that sense of meaning. They lived in a society with many different voices saying many different things, and postmodernism played into this, which was there, from below in the culture. Any opinion is as good as any other opinion. And there's just this really deep incoherence in the culture itself, the kind of coherence and comprehensiveness that I was reaching for. They never had the sense that that was possible. I felt if I didn't have this story, I had another one. I had to work out how everything fit together, and they were lacking that. They just didn't feel the push to understand the world in that kind of a way. And that was very difficult for me to comprehend. and this kind of this push I had, you know, to articulate a grand narrative, to work out a comprehensive worldview was kind of alien to them. And it is a thing about contemporary culture, and it's become more and more and more true. I think in the world in which we're looking now, there is a pervasive and deep mental health crisis. And what is that all about? I think a lot of that is about a lack of meaning. And not only a lack of meaning, but a lack of any sense of what it would even be to find meaning. And so, you know, I think that, and then, you know, what fills the gap is just all of this snowflakiness. I mean, oh God, I mean, they somehow feel that, you know, they're entitled to a life without stress. And actually, I heard a doctor, a psychiatrist on radio saying, I think that what we're actually promoting mental illness now instead of mental health. Everybody talk about their mental health, mental illness, and everybody has some kind of, you know, syndrome or condition, and which has to excuse them from doing anything that's difficult. Anything that'll cause stress. And I think there's something deeply, deeply, deeply wrong there. And I think it's to do with late capitalism, which is deeply, deeply decadent. And that's what we're up against to build a left. We can get hundreds of thousands on the streets with responding to the facts about the absolutely wrenching, heartbreaking injustices in Gaza at the moment. We got hundreds of thousands on the streets, you know, for the Iraq War. We can get people to rise up against these blatant particular injustices that are there for all to see. But we've been unable to marshal that to get people caught up in a comprehensive analysis of it, let alone some kind of vehicle that would transform it. Because I think that it's really become clear that there is massive disaffection from the global world order in which we live. In this whole global East-South that's organizing some kind of alternative way of structuring the world that a lot of our mass media almost totally ignores, and talks about the international community as if it were the only US, Canada, the EU, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan. And there's a lot of the rest of the world that isn't part of that. And they are vastly alienated from the global system and organizing some kind of alternative. It's not capitalism versus socialism anymore, but socialism is somehow in there. But even those of us that live within these parts of the world, there are vast numbers of our population that are deeply, deeply alienated from it, but without an analysis of it, let alone a strategy or vehicle to move from this to something else. And that is really our challenge. It's a massive challenge.
What motivates me really, I mean, as a Marxist, is the view that, and I don't mean this in some kind of quasi-religious way, you know, but only Marxism really offers the way for a fully functioning and equal global society. Because for me, what's always been important is that socialism or Marxism, whatever you want to call it, it is based on two things, the fulfillment of two things. One is political democracy, by which I don't mean like parliament or whatever, you know, in its current form, but the way of everyone being involved and participating and being able to, you know, play a role in decision making and determining what kind of society we have, etc., whatever structures one finds for doing that. And that also it's based on economic democracy, by economic democracy. Obviously, you don't have a very small number of people owning everything and no one else having very much to speak of. And some people have massive houses and other people don't have anywhere to live. You know, you have a kind of democratic distribution and organization of society and what is produced. And only those two things can actually resolve the crises of the world, you know, the inequality, the poverty, and so on. And now, of course, I would add to that the other factors that are very important, you know, sort of as kind of subsets, are economic planning. Okay, so you have to plan to ensure you meet everyone's needs. That's very important. But also, of course, it has to be a red-green plan. So if you've got a red-green plan based on political and economic democracy, that will pretty much cover everything as far as I can see. And Marxism is the framework with all the other twiddly bits on it, you know, which can provide for that. And I think that that's very compelling. And I think that that's I mean, lots of young people nowadays, they say, oh, I'm a communist, because it makes sense. You know, it explains what happens and how things happen, and it poses an alternative of how things can happen.
We've long wanted to open up discussion among longtime monthly review devotees, and this is the first time we really had the chance to do that in full. And so I want to acknowledge and thank Helena for having maybe kind of a more direct democratic approach to this whole thing and wanting to hear from you all and create that space. Thank you for joining us for Monthly Review Press's discussion series, MR Conversations, for this far-reaching conversation. And you might have noticed it was sort of a debate. Obviously, we don't have total agreement within the left. We have vastly differing opinions. We do have a fair number of questions now for you. I'm just going to kind of rattle them all off, and then try Helena and Daniel and Kate to figure out which ones, you know, are feeling most resonant with you, and we'll go from there. So Michael Falconer said, if you think the great proletarian cultural revolution was the equivalent of the Lansky trials, you probably can't make revolution. Larry Tallman said the geopolitical emphasis in dealing with the Soviet Union is important, but it doesn't adequately deal with the everyday structure of work, community, and politics in general. As Michael Leibowitz wrote, the late, great Leibowitz, it is insufficient to simply have conductors determining what should be a meaningful democratic underpinning of society. And related to that, we had a question from Joel Schwartz about how many of us, internationally speaking, have a really hard time handling power once we get it in an ethical, democratic way. Christopher Pearson asked, what is your appraisal of the value of social media as a tool for nurturing mass movements? Is it a net plus or a net minus? We know Twitter has lost most of its values, thanks to you know who. Are there other tools that might work better? We got some morale boosters in the chat, and Gary Crane offered a few of those, and he asked what we can do about the tragic lack of experimentation with respect to strategy and tactics in the climate, anti-war, healthcare, housing rights, and anti-fascism movements. And he quoted Gandhi and asked for some kind of a response to this quote. The science of nonviolent resistance is young, and the most important discoveries are yet to be made. And Mario Galvin asked any suggestions, this is the big one, for how to convert the hundreds of thousands of disaffected protesters into a coherent political force for change. So these questions really sum up the conversation we just had in a lot of ways. And I think as a starting point, just because that's quite a lot to respond to, I want to start giving Helena a chance to talk about the song we listened to, Red Flag. I played the Billy Bragg version. That wasn't the one she really wanted me to play. She wanted me to play the Jim Connell version.
So, Red Flag has been a major international anthem of the left. It's been sung on many big and small occasions. And it was composed by an Irish leftist at the end of the 19th century called Jim Connell. We have a Red Flag festival celebrating him. in rural County Meath since the 1990s. And I mentioned that in the book. But the song has been around in the world, and it just I was just saying to Daniel when we were talking before that it reminded me of when I was a Catholic. The final verse from which the title of the book has come, it reminded me of Faith of Our Fathers, which I sang very ardently when I was a young Catholic. And then when I became a Marxist, um, I sang the final verse of Red Flag with the same fervor. I think that we need rituals um, where we articulate and celebrate our really basic views and values in a collective manner. And I think songs, especially anthems like Red Flag, play a really important role in that. Jim Connell wrote the tune wrote the words to the tune of White Cockade, which is what you heard Billy Bragg and also Dick Gaughan singing. The Scottish voice there was Dick Gaughan. But the movement itself preferred the Tannenbaum version. Jim Connell thought it was more of a dirge, but I like the dirge. I like the heaviness and world historical quality of the Tannenbaum version of the Red Flag. Yeah, that's the Red Flag. And both the image of the red flag is on the cover of the book, as well as the words from the song. So it's an important image for the book. I think the Soviet painting, which is on the cover, is also deeply moving. Somebody dropping the red flag and then another person coming and picking it up. And that captured the feeling that I had about this book. I wanted to write about this movement and what I had gathered from the past of the generations that came before me, or the way I lived through it along with all the people I encountered on the left during this, and the way I feel about coming to my end game and passing this on to, I hope, further generations that will carry on this great movement. I'm not going to address the whole story of how I got into it because I've written these books telling the story, and but I want to answer some of the just touch the main points of some of those questions if I can.
There was one more question I just wanted to add.
Yeah.
We were talking about Ireland, and it seems like the right time to ask. Sean Prendeville asks what Helena thinks about the recent Dublin riot as a starting point.
Oh, God. They were horrific, actually. I've lived here over 50 years, and I've never seen anything like what happened on Thursday night. Never. We didn't actually have that much of a far right. We had a kind of traditional Catholic right that were still, going on about fornication when anybody would listen to them, but nobody did. But it's only since COVID that we've actually had the far right on the streets. First going on about the pandemic, and now the major issue is emigration. We haven't had a major migration problem until the war in Ukraine, but people aren't coming out on the streets against Ukrainians. It's all these other people that have been coming, but it's the massive numbers from Ukraine that have created the crisis and how to accommodate refugees, and nobody holds it against Ukraine, but people against, and we have a whole two-tier asylum system, which is kind of scandalous, that Ukrainians are in 5-star hotels and the other people can just sleep on tents in the streets if they can even get a tent. And so there's a lot of tension in the country, especially in the last year, about migration. And but how any of this leads somebody to burn public transport, to drag workers off buses, it's a bit of a shock. But these things are global. This restlessness about migration and who lives where and who's entitled to what, and all the forces, and this is not talked about enough, all the forces that are forcing people to migrate. aren't being articulated enough. Well, I mean, the real big geopolitical forces. Everybody goes on and on about the war in Ukraine without talking about the real geopolitical forces that are in motion in the war in Ukraine. Which brings me back to Eastern Europe. I think that is a lot of the fallout from the end of the Soviet Union and the downfall of socialism in Eastern Europe. And you know, what does one questioner asked, what's the Slansky trial have to do with the Cultural Revolution? And I could also add the purges in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. And one person said that, you know, the left is very good at its critique of power, but handling power. And so we have a lot of very negative examples in the history of socialists coming to power, of how not to do it. And one thing all of these things have in common, and I could add other instances too, is this ultra leftist approach of, you know, not of forcing a worldview and forcing a system on people, instead of persuading them. And a lot of people that were caught up in the purges in the Soviet Union, in the Cultural Revolution in China, the Slansky trial, these were people who wanted to build socialism. And that is the one, absolutely one thing that can never, ever be done again, is, you know, not to allow discussion and debate, and not to allow room for alternative views about how to build socialism when you're trying to build socialism. And some of them were the people that had most to offer to building socialism, particularly like I spent a lot of time studying and writing about the purges in the Soviet Union and what became of particularly of academic institutions, but it's what played out in every aspect of life in the Soviet Union. And we do have to learn from that. And the big question is, how do we mobilize what we've all agreed here is a massive, deep disaffection from the global system. And we can mobilize hundreds of thousands. In the period coming up to the Iraq War, we mobilized millions. The Occupy movement mobilized millions. We've had these mass movements, and in Gaza, there are millions of people on the streets all over the world that are moved by it. How do we go from that to building a more sustainable movement that ties everything together? Now, I believe that as much as I would defend the role that communist parties, Marxist, Leninist, vanguard parties once played, I don't think they're the vehicle for the future. I think that we need to build broad left parties. We actually do need parties. We have to contest for state power. You know, you get everybody on the streets and they have their say, and then what? You know, we have to have a sustainable way to, and everything isn't about, you know, about political elections and state power, but the state is a crucial institution, and we have to be contenders for state power. And I think that we need broad left parties that have this, that have a Marxist analysis as platforms within that. I was very enthusiastic at one stage about Syriza, and I still think that that was a good strategy, as badly as it crashed and burnt. But I think we need to, so we not only need to contest elections, and another question here asked about social media as a tool for nurturing mass movements. I say absolutely. I think social media are fantastic tools for mobilizing. And those of us that are old enough to remember these old mimeograph machines and all these pieces of paper that we'd have to physically pin on places, and the way you can get news about a demonstration or a point of view across on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram and all these other ones. I think we have to use them. I mean, we are using them, of course, but we have to use them even more. And things like Zoom seminars. I mean, I know Zoom seminars became a big thing during COVID. But like a lot of the Zoom seminars I attended during COVID, and other people obviously did too, were they weren't things that we would have been able to go to anyway. Okay, there were things where people in the same university were meeting on Zoom instead of meeting on the campus, but there were seminars all over the world, and we all couldn't have gone to those anyway, whether it was a global pandemic or not. And so it's proved to be a sustainable tool for having international audiences get together and discussing the very things that we're discussing now. How do we take this massive disaffection and how do we build something from it? Of course, none of us have some kind of magic formula or an answer, but we all have some sense of some of the elements that are needed. If only we could convince enough other people that these are the elements that we need, and this is the path that we have to take, and this is what we have to do. And social media and all these internet tools are brilliant for it.
I want to jump in and let some of the people who are here in this session with us maybe speak their own questions. So specifically starting with Mario Galvin.
Thank you very much. This has been a great conversation. Thank you all. My question has to do with, I'll just read it. Aside from the political opposition we face, how can we deal with the constant bombardment of the media that assaults us with psychological appeals to emotion instead of our rational minds? I think everyone knows that Madison Avenue advertising came out. It was the grandson of Sigmund Freud who brought that into being, and it's, I think, an even more powerful negative influence on our society than just the political. So I think, obviously, all of the millions of dollars that are spent on political campaigns are usually just a 30-second ad. It's not a rational argument. It's like who to be afraid of. So anyway, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here.
I think we have to appeal to rationality and emotion. And I think I find a problem with making that a really sharp distinction. I think definitely we have to make arguments and, use logic and evidence. But to me, a good argument also evokes emotion. And I think that is the way we have to go, put forward good arguments with logic and evidence that have emotion and also appeal to people's emotions, their sense, especially their sense of injustice.
Well, just very quickly on that point there, I know that we are all incredibly bombarded with this stuff. But what amazes me, looking particularly at the Gaza war and everything that's taking place there, you would imagine as a result, I don't know what it's like where you all live, but here in Britain, the media is incredibly biased, let's say. I don't even need to go into it, the way different, children in one place is described completely different to children in another place, and so on, But what's amazing is even though there is, like full-on saturation with that, you still have a situation where when there was an opinion poll recently, it showed that 76% of the population wanted a ceasefire, and you have, 500,000 people or more, regularly, getting on for 1 million people out demonstrating here and, of course, internationally as well. So even though we are bombarded, I think we do retain our critical faculties, and not just those of us who are kind of, professionally engaged in being critical, but the overwhelming majority of the population. And, maybe it's a rational thing on their part, maybe it's also a deep humanitarian instinct, but whatever it is, it means they have rejected that narrative and they are choosing to support something else. So that's how I feel about that. I'm not underplaying the fact that that is a problem, but we do have sort of mass resistance to that, albeit in an unorganized form. Is this the point to comment on some of the other questions? Is that okay? I'll just try and do that briefly. I just think they're really interesting questions, so I'm going to try not to overstretched myself, because I'm sure people are a lot more expert than I am here. But just the one on the proletarian cultural revolution from Michael, that I found that really interesting. And I'm in no sense an expert on China post-revolution or anything like that, but it always struck me that the proletarian cultural revolution was an attempt to deal with some of the abuses of holding power, which kind of came up in the next question about, about that. And it was a way of trying to deal with developing inequalities, with bureaucratization, with new forms of elitism developing, And when I was, a young person, as a communist, I always found the idea of, didn't appreciate it so much when I became an academic, but the idea of, go out into the countryside and dig ditches and get out of your ivory tower, So however flawed that was, and whatever terrible consequences it had, nevertheless, it was an attempt to try and redress wrongs that were developing, and so that sort of goes into the next question, really, about how do you handle power in an ethical and democratic way, and that's enormously difficult as well. I mean, these things are these things ever soluble? But if you have a kind of revolutionary transformation, by definition, you are coming to power in the context of a class war, aren't you? You're trying to kick out the old guard, get rid of the imperialists, the capitalists, and all that kind of thing. And I guess, I haven't been in that position myself, but I guess, you can't do it by being nice. You are fighting a class war. That's what it is. So how do you then conduct that class war in a way that is ethical? And I think you have to have ethics, but maybe the ethics are different to the kind of ethics, that we have in our normal everyday life. I remember having a discussion with someone about the Greek Civil War, because someone was saying, the lefties used, if people were in the front line of the battle and they were kind of, wanting to desert, maybe they would be shot. Is that an ethical thing? When you're in the middle of a war, battles for survival, is that ethical or not? So you have to kind of rethink your ethics and what is necessary and possible in different situations. So I just think these things are extraordinarily hard. And although we have to maintain our principles and our values, I think we have to understand, looking back, how extraordinarily difficult it will have been for people to try and take those developments forward. That massive revolution in Russia, how do you take that forward? And what you said, Michael, about the proletarian cultural revolution as well, it reminded me about, Lenin's new economic policy, 1921, trying to deal with the problems of war communism, which were incredibly harsh, but then that allowed the development of a middle class economically. So then they tried to deal with that, so then you had the first 5-year plan and the harshness and hardships of that. It's like, how is it possible ever to come to the kind of loveliness that we all want as a result of socialism? It is, I can imagine it would just be an ongoing struggle for an incredibly long period of time. And we've seen how even when you've got power, like Allende and people like that, what you then face, and even the lawfare against people like Lula when he was previously president, and all those things. It's just an ongoing massive struggle. And at risk of not wanting to disagree with Helena, but I'm just going to take up this thing you said about snowflakes. I think I don't really go along with that particularly, because on the demonstrations, like, the overwhelming majority of people are young. They're the people coming out and fighting. And on all the demonstrations pretty much here, since the start of COVID, when we had all kinds of things, we had the Black Lives Matter thing, we had women's demonstrations, overwhelmingly young, pretty much the left, and it's the old left, had pretty much nothing to contribute. You know, we couldn't mobilize that on our own. You know, our hearts were in the right place and all that sort of thing. But I'm very reluctant to kind of diss young people because, you know, when they're motivated, they are fighters. I'm not saying there aren't people who think, yeah, we'd like to get a mortgage and all that sort of thing. Got to get a good job, but they will come out and fight. And I think that's really important. And then my final thing, just to say, I mean, it's this question about how do you convert, you know, things like this mass protest into a force for change. And you made the point about party, Helena, and that's the thing. It's, you know, I'm involved primarily in the movement, so to speak, you know, peace, anti-war, and so on. But I absolutely get that is not enough by itself to bring about a transformation of society, because it's only addressing specific things, even if they are important parts of the whole. You've got to have something that addresses the whole. The problem, as far as I can see it, is that people are disaffected with parties. That may not be the case all over the world, but it's certainly the case here, you know. And so so that's the thing. People don't really want a party, to be honest, but they want organisation. So how do you kind of bring some kind of synergistic relationship between those two things? And final point, Helena, you were saying, you know, you want broad left party, and you pointed out I've spent the last decade trying to build a broad left party. And I must say that in the past months, I've started to think that actually, can a broad left party really deal with what's going on in the world today? And don't we need a much stronger anti-imperialist heart to that, and a much perhaps clearer Marxist framework for it? I'm not saying I haven't arrived at a conclusion around that, but I'm thinking, you know, now anti-imperialism is absolutely fundamental to the continued existence of humanity, you know, so what's the best vehicle for that?
I'm sure that that Helena has responses to some of what you said, and Daniel hasn't spoken yet. But because we've got you, Kate, and Charles Pinderhughes asked a question that would be most relevant to you, I want to give him a chance to ask you that question real quick.
I was asking, in seeking electoral state power, and maybe we should add in mature democracies, how do we avoid the corruption of socialist vision and principles that has occurred in the British Labour Party, for example, for the last 100 years or so?
I first of all feel like I need to contest mature democracies as a description, but I'm not going to go there. I mean, the problem with the Labour Party, you know, is the Labour Party is not a socialist party. I don't think it's ever been a socialist party. It has at best been a social democratic party, you know, in the sense that I understand it from my generation or whatever, about Keynesianism, the welfare state, and all that kind of thing. It's been, you know, it was founded by the trade unions to support, to give them a political voice, you know, so it wasn't founded on any kind of revolutionary basis, you know. And in the First World War, which was, you know, the big kind of litmus test, it didn't oppose the First World War as an imperialist war or anything like that. It signed off on it and all that kind of thing. And as a result of many of them doing that, you know, the communist movement arose. So, and the Labour Party has been responsible for the development of the British atom bomb and British participation and founding of NATO and like a million bad things, essentially. And they maintain those positions. Now, it's sort of somewhat redeemed itself after the Second World War by being kind of founding the welfare state, and many great things, and social mobility and equality and all that kind of stuff. But it hasn't subsequently really defended that, you know. And I suppose the kind of the further to watershed was when Blair came in and after Thatcher, and then adopted neoliberal economic policies with a few soft twiddly bits, and now under Keir Starmer the soft twiddly bits have gone, so that's what it is. And you've got the Labour leadership supporting essentially genocide in Gaza, so that's the situation. We had a period starting in 2015, where Jeremy Corbyn was elected to office through a kind of blip in the way that they'd changed Labour Party membership and election processes, coinciding with the kind of Syriza wave and everything, which Helena talks about, in the sort of, squares movement and everything. That was the kind of how the UK manifestation of that popped out through the Corbyn movement. But I don't want to sound as though, I knew what was going to happen. But actually, I never thought that it would be possible for the Labour Party to be won back, even for social democracy, never mind socialism. That's just the reality of it. And sadly, I was right. So we got the big challenge here now. You have a lot of people desperate for change. We got loads of Labour councillors resigning from Labour over the Gaza war. We've got increasing number of small but increasing number of MPs, now independent because, of not wanting to be in the Labour Party, and so on. And that kind of independence thing is going to be a big factor moving forward. But because of the nature of our electoral system, which is first past the post, it's nigh on impossible to have an electoral competitor to Labour from the left. And, I'm personally not stuck on electoral politics. If we can do something, good, but it just doesn't seem to be possible here. And, I don't know about other places, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But we need to think about other ways of organising, from my point of view, non-violent, that's the kind of thing for me, but other ways of organising that aren't necessarily what you might expect in a mature democracy.
I think that what we are seeing now, at least what I'm seeing in Brooklyn and in New York City, and perhaps across the United States, is somewhat similar to what we're talking about in both in the UK and in Ireland, which is that we have a very strong fascist movement that has emerged. We have in the United States, for sure, a divided and disorganized, but very huge socialist movement, which has an unusual capability, which is that it actually reaches out to people in motion. But I had a question about momentum. Many years ago, momentum, I thought, gave momentum to Corbyn in England. And I had been a subscriber and person listening to Momentum, and they seem to have vanished. And I had thought that their Momentum was making an effort to actually create a popular movement in the Labour Party. Has that all just vanished into dust? How could that have disappeared?
Well, just very quickly about Momentum. Momentum was founded to be something that was both inside and outside the Labour Party. It was, it was because a lot of the people who voted for Jeremy, because of this new form of electing things, weren't actually in the Labour Party. They were supporters. So tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people joined, some of which were full Labour Party members and some of which were outside. And the idea was to develop Momentum as the movement which would bring in and out together, and obviously, as a lot of the small left is outside the Labour Party and some of it's in. So that was the purpose of Momentum. Very rapidly, it became an inside the Labour Party organisation only. So here, where in my borough. Hundreds of people signed up for Momentum. We all got the first email inviting us to a meeting, but only those who were actually Labour Party members were then invited to the subsequent one. So already it was a kind of process of kind of institutionalizing Momentum and making it a kind of part of the party structures. And once it had been cut off from the wider movement, it was only going to, be kind of sucked more and more into the Labour Party apparatus, which was never under the control of Corbyn, essentially. So that's what happened.
Well, that sounds like the kind of worry that we all have in the U.S. about the Democratic Socialists, is that it's so active in the Democratic Party processes that it could easily get absorbed and not have its independent status be as important. So yes, that's a very useful and interesting part of the story. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I have a few responses to Kate there, with whom I agree about nearly everything all the time, but like there are nuances here and there, which is natural. But actually, by snowflakes, I wasn't actually referring to the people that come out in our protests and are part of our movements. I'm referring to the ones who don't do that, actually. The ones I encounter in universities and in the wider culture. And I do think there is a real problem about an extreme individualism and sort of self-cultivated fragility that I think is dangerous for the future of civilization, actually. But also, I was struck by what Kate said about electoral politics being difficult being difficult to get enthusiastic about or put too much energy into in Britain because of the electoral system. And this is the case. I mean, this is very different from our situation in Ireland, where we have a different electoral system. We have proportional representation. And that means that we actually can achieve results in not only local elections, but even elections to the national parliament. We have radical leftists, even Marxists, in our national parliament. Once you're elected, it's not only that you can introduce legislation or opposition to legislation, but it makes you part of the national discourse in a way that you're not if you're not elected. The broadcasters, especially public service broadcasters, have to pay attention to any force that's electable. And Marxism in Ireland is actually part of that spectrum. And I'm very proud that we achieved that. But again, I don't think that we should think that electoral politics is everything. That I think that we have to pay attention to being active in trade unions, in universities, and definitely anti-imperialist movements and ecological movements. But I definitely think that forming, if we can, broad left parties that contest for state power, but also are involved in all of these movements actively and in trade unions and all the institutions of society. And I think they need to have a strong Marxist driving force. I think they have to be movements where you don't have to be a Marxist to be part of them. But I don't think that they'll be very substantial unless there are Marxists in there making the case and being an influence on the direction of the movement, and especially the nurturing of new activists. So I think it would be, I know that Britain actually had a referendum about the electoral system some years ago and lost, but I think might be a good idea to have another referendum about PR. And I'd also love you to have a movement about monarchy. There's actually a growing anti-monarchist movement in Britain. And I've always been kind of shocked that the British left didn't make more of a motion in the direction of abolishing the monarchy. And I think it's a good time to start building that along with all of the other things that we have to make our case about. But I think that also one thing that makes, contemporary left movements different from the past is a strong emphasis on ecology. And I think the left has really, got itself together on that. Again, there are a lot of differences even within eco-socialism, growth versus degrowth, and all of this. But these are things we have to take on, not only intellectually, but be part of building a mass movement around this, because the science is there, and the climate change we can see before our very eyes is there, and the way we're living is not sustainable. So I think the tasks for people like us are monumental, but we're needed to address these things intellectually, and to build on the streets and in social media and in every channel we have at our disposal about all of this, all of it all together, and to show the connections. It's not just adding this to that to the other thing. It's like seeing all the interconnections. That's what we're really good at.
So yeah, Larry Tallman had a question to, kind of like going deeper into the issues that you just raised. He said, things are changing very quickly to the extent that James Hansen says we're likely to hit 1.5 Celsius over the pre-industrial time next year, or at least much sooner than the IPCC has indicated, which of course John Bellamy Foster, this is his life's work recently, is highlighting these questions. So the question he asks is, tipping points are on the way much sooner than we're going to be able to defeat capitalism, sadly. How does the time frame affect what this discussion has been about? And obviously this is a huge question, and we pose these questions to ourselves constantly, and we don't often have great answers, but we have to keep trying. So how would you take a stab at this monumental question, any of the three of you?
Nearly every issue of Monthly Review for a good few years now addresses this, and addresses it in a lot of detail. Of course, John Bellamy Foster is editor, and but lots of other writers. I think Monthly Review is playing a very important role in addressing exactly these questions in a sustained way, better than any of us can kind of come in and say something in a few minutes right now.
Through that, yeah, I mean, I think that the question that might be, and again, we may not be able to answer this, but the thing that maybe we need, that we're all going to sleep with, is this question of time, how kind of the time scale might have changed. That if you have a long view, or a sense of, longue durée, excuse my French, of history, and you understand that there's cycles to movements, and in the past we might have all had kind of a sense of faith that, or using the Jewish aphorism, it is not your duty to finish the work, but but you have to continue it. Basically, you do your best, right? So we put ourselves on the line throughout our lives, and we hope that the next generation kind of learns from some of our mistakes, that we ourselves learn from some of our mistakes, and we can pass on some lessons learned. And now the question is, do the next few generations have enough time to learn from our mistakes and their own? And so I think we probably all go to bed thinking about this. And given that, how do we wake up in the morning? How do we keep going? And this is what your book is about. It is about long distance life on the left. Maybe the specter of climate change changes how we think about that more than anything. But how do we keep going? How do we, in addition to learning from our defeats and moving on, what keeps us getting up every day and working on these issues as ever before?
Because life isn't worth living if we don't. We just can't not do it. It leaves the terrain uncontested. It leaves the effort on the fight unfought. We just can't do that, and it's just not thinkable. If you've lived your life so far thinking the things that we've thought, we can't do otherwise.
Yes, I mean, I agree with what Helena says about that. And I mean, obviously also recognizing that for millions of people around the world. It's not a kind of choice, whether to go and dig the garden or go on the demo. For a lot of people, it's a matter of life and death. The people in Gaza don't have a choice, but I suppose the other thing is also not to, because you're talking about learning from our defeats. Someone said defeats several times, and yeah, that's true. But also, it's not that we are doing something wrong and therefore we're defeated. Otherwise you'd just give up, presumably. Oh, I failed. That's not what it's about. What it's about is the balance of forces globally, and being part of something to shift the balance of forces globally. And we've seen that it's possible, there are many examples of when that has taken place, in many cases where the results of that are still ongoing, particularly thinking of, national liberation struggles, which we mentioned earlier on, inspired by revolutionary ideas and revolutionary movements, and those are part of the process too, so it's to keep on building that force that will shift that global balance. And that's what we all have to be part of.
Daniel, do you have any thoughts?
I guess I remain the cockeyed optimist. I see the forces at play in the United States, and I believe in Ireland and in France, and perhaps other places that I'm not paying attention to. But certainly in those places, it feels as though while we face enormous challenges, we're in much better place to respond to them than we have been in my entire lifetime. So I'm absolutely thrilled to be part of a socialist movement. I think there's plenty of room for us to do better, but we are doing amazingly well. So I'm the cockeyed optimist in this, I guess. I think we're way ahead of where we were even last year. There are more socialists in Congress. There are more socialists in the state legislators. There are more socialists in City Hall than ever before. And we're very close to having some very small effects, even though we're starting from much worse position than we were. Things are getting better. So yes, there's fascists out there. Yes, there's an incredibly difficult struggle. Yes, the fossil fuel industry still has vast power, but inch by inch, we're narrowing the gaps.
We'll probably close out soon. I think it's very important for us to end, especially given this book and its subject matter, on this note. I really appreciated, Kate, what you said about, I think a lot of times we all think that we confuse ourselves and our identity with the movement, right? We think that we ourselves are the movement. And so if the movement experiences a defeat, which is a relative term, what is we don't want to be too relativistic, Helena, but what is defeat is a question for us. For really, it's a whole other conversation we should have.
I think the point that Kate made, that many of our defeats aren't because of our own mistakes or because we were wrong. It's because of the balance of forces. We didn't lose arguments, but we were overwhelmed by power that was stronger, that was brought to bear on us and defeated. I think most of our defeats are a combination of those things, but primarily they were about the balance of forces.
I just want to thank you, Helena, for taking the time that you have to reflect in the way that you have in writing this book, Until We Fall. And I haven't yet read Navigating the Zeitgeist, but I will take a look at it. So those of you who are familiar with Helena Sheehan's work, you might know that this is the follow-up to Navigating the Zeitgeist. That was kind of volume 1. Until We Fall is volume 2. And there are other books, of course, that you can find, including the Syriza Wave, which Monthly Review Press published too, and an incredible amount of work going back many, many decades. So thank you to Helena, and thank you to Kate and Daniel. We appreciate your diving into this conversation so deeply, and thank you to the rest of you for coming and joining us today. We hope to be able to have more open conversations like this in the future.
Thank you.
Yes.
Bye all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
It waves above our infant nights when all our hands seem dark as night. It witnessed many a leaden bough, we mustn't change its colour now. Raise the scarlet standard high, beneath its folds we'll live and die. No cowards flinch and traitors sneer, we'll keep the red flag flying here. It well recalls the triumphs past, it gives the hope of peace at last. The banner bright, the symbol plain of human right and human gain. Raise the scarlet standard high, beneath its folds we'll live or die. No cowards flinch and traitors sneer, we'll keep the red flag flying here. It suits the day, the meek and base, whose minds are fixed on health and place. To cringe beneath the rich man's frown and haul that sacred emblem down. Raise the scarlet standard high, beneath its folds we'll live and die. No cowards flinch and traitors sneer, we'll keep the red flag flying here. With heads uncovered, swear we all to bear it on board till we fall. Come dungeons dark or gallows grim, this song shall be our parting hymn. Raise the scarlet standard high, beneath its walls we'll live and die. Though cowards flinch and traitors sneer, we'll keep the red flag flying here.